Dread it, run from it, destiny still arrives.
We all know who returned this month. Love him or hate him, Jon Jones has made his beloved return to the UFC. Fans have been waiting years for this return. His fight with Ciryl Gane has been the most hyped fight in years. With Jon Jones being out for so many years, it would have taken a lot of the bread to bring him back. For this event, the UFC brought in $12.15 million at the gate, making it a top 4 most successful card ever. With the pay-per-view buys included, this increases it to roughly $30 million. For being the main attraction as to this otherwise mediocre card, Jon Jones was awarded $2 million, which on paper sounds incredibly good. However, when taken into account gym fees, management fees and taxes, this amount drops drastically. Ciryl Gane, the man who had to face the greatest UFC fighter of all time, was paid $300k. Again, after these gym fees, paying his manager, he might end up with $300k, while being the fan favourite weight division's world champion. The rest of the card were made much less than this also. Grasso, the new champion, she was only paid $210,000. Bo Nickel, one of the most hyped prospects in the UFC at this moment, paid $21,000. Trayvon Jones, who fought the former UFC champion Cody Garbrandt, walked away with only $36,000. All of these figures are prior to any taxes and fees, and roughly half that. Compared to other sports like the NHL and NFL that pay their athletes 50% of the revenue, the UFC pay roughly 16 to 20%. This shows the difference in the appreciation and compensation for their athletes. The competition for the UFC right now has become boxing, and in all honesty, it can be whittled down to one man. In the last few years, Jake Paul has faced 3 different UFC fighters, with 2 of them being elite champions. He's faced these guys 4 times, beating them all 4 times, while having them all say it was the most they had ever been paid out of almost all of their UFC time, even while they were champions. The UFC being the Goliath of MMA, having almost no threat of someone fighting for another promotion since they killed all the competition, how can Dana White and the UFC get away with being so greedy? The UFC was originally the smaller company in MMA. This was due to Pride being a massive success in Korea, with insane fighters like Fedor, Overeem and many others. The UFC had to prioritise treating their fighters well because they could simply go to Pride. The switch to the UFC we know today started when Pride started to fall off in the iconic Season 1 of The Ultimate Fighter. Dana White has said himself that the Forrest Griffin-Stephen Bonner fight was the reason for the UFC surviving. This was the spark that the UFC needed. Over the next few years, UFC started to completely outside Pride and became the top dog. The moment that killed all the competition with the UFC was right after this man hopped on the mic. Conor McGregor single-handedly destroyed all of the competition for the UFC by being the most entertaining fighter since Mike Tyson. After Conor became the champion, the UFC were never in fear of the competition again. When you think of professional MMA companies, there's the UFC and then there's nothing. There's one championship in Bellator, however these aren't even competition to the UFC, provide no challenge to them ever. This means that over time, the UFC has been able to provide less and less compensation to the fighters and do whatever suits them, since there is nowhere else they can go. The average pay for a fighter last year in the UFC was around $150k, which sounds very nice, but this is pre-tax, so you can remove around $40k. And they still need their gym fees and manager fees, which is roughly 15%, so this drops us to $90k, which is still well above the average wage. However, the average person is not the average UFC fighter. These UFC fighters are better than over 90% of the population easily. Many people would say as a fighter, 90k is still good. However, this stat is so skewed because of stars like Jon Jones and Conor McGregor who are getting millions per fight. In 2020, 20% of all UFC fighters made less than minimum wage, meaning less than $25,000 in the whole year. Didn't used to be the case for the UFC, however. This is because the UFC used to allow fighters to have their own sponsors, which not only helped the fighters with their pay, but it also looked extremely cool and created some of the most iconic trunks ever. However, this did not benefit the UFC, and well, that just can't slide with Uncle Dana, so he decided to do the worst deal in UFC history. The Reebok deal is single-handedly the worst thing the UFC has ever done for the fighters. Basically what this deal was is it made Reebok the sole sponsor and provider of gear in the UFC. This removed all the sponsors the fighters had earned for themselves. Many fighters said that this has removed tens of thousands of dollars, even for the smaller fighters. Fighter pay before Reebok deal was not mentioned much. It was still poor, but fighters could make a very good living being the elite fighters that they are. However, the UFC wasn't promoting from the sponsorships the fighters got themselves. Many of the fighters in the UFC do not get paid what they deserve. We'll take a look at Paulo Costa, who fought for the middleweight title while on a contract for $100k per fight. This was for a championship fight. This is criminally low for a fighter of his caliber, and at the time, many thought he could win that title belt. Because of the lack of the competition in MMA, they can't go anywhere. However, there's a new option that many hadn't thought of before. The biggest fighting event in the last 2 decades has been between a drunk Irish bar fighter and one of the greatest boxers ever. This is the new option for MMA fighters, both current and retired, and it all started with the explosion of influencer boxing. This has created an opportunity for UFC fighters to make money that they deserve. UFC fighters such as Ben Askren, Tyron Woodley, and Anderson Silva have all competed in these boxing events and have all fought Jake Paul. All 3 of these UFC fighters said that these fights alone have earned them more than their entire UFC careers. Many fighters have been switching over to boxing ever since the Mayweather-McGregor fight. It has opened some competition for the UFC so that they have to treat their fighters better. I would assume that over the next few years we will continue to see ex-UFC fighters compete in boxing events with influencers in order to get that money that they deserve. However, I would even expect some current UFC fighters to go and do boxing events during their UFC careers purely because they can earn so much more money from this. We've begun to see a rebellion against the UFC's mistreatment of fighters, which originally started with the icon Mark Hunt many years ago, but has since been revived by Ngannou, who was the heavyweight champion and recently became a free agent because of the UFC's not meeting his understandable demands, the main one being healthcare for UFC fighters. I hope the UFC fighters continue to push the UFC to be fairer. With this influx of fighters leaving and pursuing boxing, it will be interesting to watch the UFC and see whether it survives this or whether it has to adapt to the new era and pay their fighters better. Thank you for watching this video till the end. It means a lot to me, guys. If you did have a little bit of fun in this video or you learned something new, then please tickle the like button. Have a great day, guys. Peace.